And the pen ran wild. Episode 1, the story begins. Joey would always refer to me, his big sister, as Cissy. Sometimes he was a real pain in the butt, especially when I had to keep an eye on him. I'd go over to a friend's house, wanting to play girl stuff like dress up our dolls, with Joey tagging behind. Now, what was he supposed to do? Play with the dolls too? So whenever he came along, I was only able to stay a short time since Joey would get bored and start whining about this and that. Then there were times when Joey was the only one I played with, and because of this, my little brother became my best friend. As he grew older, him and I began going on adventures. Sometimes we let our imagination run wild, just as imagining someone entering our house when the door would open and no one was there. We pretended there was someone and gave him or her a name. Now, there were also times when Joey and I saw something we couldn't quite explain, and if we told anyone about it, like our parents, they just think it was only our imagination. As adults, Joey and I still stayed in touch, even after we both got married and lived apart. No matter how far life took us, we still managed to find a way to keep in touch. In the summer of 2018, I received a phone call on a Friday afternoon from the Bartow Police Department about Joey. At first, I thought my younger brother was in jail for doing something stupid. You see, Joey had a history of ending up in jail for this and that. So I hung up on the police officer, not wanting to deal with Joey getting arrested. But I was wrong. So wrong. After the police officer called a second time, I decided I may as well find out what he did wrong this time. I discovered my little brother Joey had died in his bed. He had been alone at the time. 2 weeks prior to finding out about Joey's death, he had been in the ICU at Lakeland General Hospital for having pneumonia. He had told me over the phone that he wanted to come home. The night before he was released from ICU, Mom and Dad came to see him. They told him he needed to leave the hospital. Now, of course, as a listener, you wouldn't know this, but our dad passed away in 2007, and our mother a year later. If that doesn't make your skin crawl, I don't know what will, except seeing the boogeyman. I believed Joey about our parents' visit, since him and I had seen and experienced a number of unexplained phenomena throughout our lives. Our mother had been a psychic, telling fortunes through reading someone's tea leaves, while our dad had been an intuitive. He just knew when things were about to happen. As soon as possible, I made arrangements to fly down from my home in Virginia to Florida to help bury my brother. Mike, my older brother, met me at the airport, and we began discussing Joey's burial arrangements, which would lead us to Lakeland, where Joey would be buried. We had to stop at Joey's home to pick up clothing for his burial. Mike freaked out. He stepped inside Joey's house and had to leave. Since Joey's bedroom was upstairs, that's where I went so I could select the clothes he would be buried in. Once inside his bedroom, I saw the crumpled sheets and knew that's where he had slept, and of course, where he had died. An overwhelming feeling came over me to pick up a blue elephant on a nightstand near his bed. That blue elephant had sentimental value. It stood for a time when Joey and I were young, and we worried we wouldn't get anything for Christmas. It was a time when our father began having night terrors. He stopped working, and we nearly lost our home. Joey had wanted a bicycle for Christmas, and instead of getting one, he had to settle for getting a blue elephant. Mom was able to smooth it over by telling him how special he was and that not just anyone gets such a prize. The memory of getting a blue elephant for Christmas stayed with Joey throughout his life, and even though the blue elephant he had on his nightstand was not the original one, it still stood for the power of unconditional love. Mother loved Joey, and that love still existed beyond the grave. After all, death is only another form of existence. I know, since I've had 3 near-death experiences in my life. The first time at the age of 2, the second during childbirth, and the last one during a surgery procedure for removing a tumor. Joey did have one near-death experience. He had died while going through the birth canal. I believe that's why he had psychic abilities, not just what he had inherited from our parents, but what he had acquired on his own from having this near-death experience. Joey was able to see the dead as well as hear their voices. I did not have this gift, and neither did anyone else in our family. But I did inherit something unique. I must refer to it as the beast. My stories, along with Joey's, are quite different. I've taken some of his to mix with mine since we sort of wrote on the same topic, our vivid childhood memories. And those memories began when our daddy wasn't able to work. I was in 3rd grade at the time, while Joey was 5 and hadn't started school. Back then, we didn't have preschool or kindergarten. A child started school at the age of 6 to enter 1st grade. So our amazing adventures with a clear accuracy for retelling begins while I was standing in line at Bryan Elementary School in Plant City, Florida, waiting to have my turn at the water fountain when George, a real creep, starts sounding off. "Shh, Mrs. Brown will hear you," I said. George sneered at me. "Your shoes are ugly just like you." I knew he was going to get it before it happened. Sometimes I just knew things and I didn't know why. It wasn't something I could control. Sometimes it was an electrical charge shooting up my spine and making me want to grit my teeth. While other times I felt sick to my stomach, like now. Whack! Mrs. Brown swung the paddle and growled, "I said no talking in line." "Ouch!" cried George, rubbing his backside. Glancing at my white plastic shoes, I had to admit George was right. They were ugly. My shoes were ripped down the side like an open can of sardines. The pair of socks I wore gave some cushion against the hard plastic digging into my skin. After everyone had a sip of water, we walked single file back into the stuffy classroom and took our seats. Mrs. Brown passed out sheets of writing paper cut in half. "It's time to take our weekly quiz on multiplication," she announced. "Make sure your name is at the top and number your paper from 1 to 20. "I hate math," I mumbled. I glanced over at Wanda, the smartest kid in class. I bet she gets another gold star on her paper. It's not fair for anyone to be that smart. It makes it hard for the rest of us. Wanda, the teacher's pet, sat behind me in a brand new desk. No one else got a new desk except for her. It wasn't fair. My desk was old. It always squeaked whenever I had to scratch or pick up something from the beige tile floor. Mrs. Brown began the oral drill as we wrote down our answers. What was that? Oh, darn, I can't remember. She's going too fast. Oh, what's the answer to that problem? Another X for me. "Pass your papers down," commanded Mrs. Brown, collecting them. I sat in the middle, and it was easy for me to see the other papers decorated with X's, like mine. I felt a little better. Maybe I wasn't the only one that was stupid. Mrs. Brown stood in front of the class, glancing at the papers and clicking her tongue. "It's obvious some students aren't studying at home. If you don't pass mathematics, you won't get promoted to the 4th grade." Gulp. I try to study at home, but it was so hard. Last night, supper had been mustard greens and fatback. I hate mustard greens. Eating that stuff made me want to gag. Mama knew this and she would tell me, pretend you're eating something you like. Then it won't taste so bad. Yeah, right, Mama. After a math lesson on fractions, everyone couldn't wait for lunch except me. My crumpled paper bag was between my desk and Tony's. Tony looked away when I reached for it. It had been 2 weeks since we last spoke to each other. Tony, short for Antonio, came from Cuba. He spoke good English, probably better than I, since I rarely opened my mouth. He was mad at me. It started with my desk. One day we were talking about my desk and how the seat would pull up. When Tony said it reminded him of a toilet bowl, I let loose. Mrs. Brown always kept a firm rule about students keeping their mouths shut and their ears open, especially when she was up front teaching. Now, here we were laughing like a pair of hyenas. Mrs. Brown called both of us to the front of the room. She asked if I had to use the restroom. I replied, "Yes, ma'am." I was so nervous about to wet my underwear. As I took care of my business, I thought about stuffing them with a thick padding of toilet paper. Then I realized Mrs. Brown would never spank me. After all, this was my first offense. But I knew before I entered the classroom, since I got this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, I was going to get it. Gosh, I hoped I had been wrong for once. But of course, I wasn't. See what happens in the next episode of And the Pen Ran Wild. Be sure to download Podomatic's mobile apps for iOS and Android.